For the past 2 decades, the status of women in Muslim marriages has come under the spotlight, and despite the looming constitutional court judgment on whether the state must be forced to establish a process towards regulating these marriages, the battle seems to be far from over.
Unfortunately, I felt like an insane person for over 20 years of all kinds of abuse.
As some insist, the state cannot interfere in Sharia law. In a constitutional democracy, should the state be forced to tamper with religious rights?
It's not a favor to Muslim women, but an obligation.
We can never subject the Quran to the constitutional principles, because there would be great conflict.
Lenasia is an area south of Johannesburg, proclaimed an Indian township in 1958 under Apartheid's Group Areas Act. Some of South Africa's 1.5 million who identify as Muslims live here. We visited the Islamic Helpline Center and Legal Clinic, which helps families and children with domestic problems.
The clinic provides services in the sphere of family law and domestic violence. We service all members of the community, provided that they fall within a means test, as we are mandated by the Legal Practice Act to provide for our clients. When you're dealing with the family dynamic, you realize that legal issues don't occur in isolation, they don't occur in a vacuum. They are accompanied by very real emotional consequences and emotional states, destructive family dynamics, there's issues of empowerment, etc. We look at what the client's needs are, what the religious principles or religious and cultural beliefs of that client is, what the requirements in terms of the economic and empowerment needs are. And then obviously we believe that you cannot resolve any dynamic without proper looking after your own emotional health. So we also provide counseling services.
This 53-year-old woman, who's currently finalizing her divorce, says she approached the help center for assistance after many years of abuse.
I've been married in an Islamic marriage, as well as the civil marriage, which is in community of property. We've been married for just over 30 years, and I experienced challenges in the marriage which we were unfortunately not able to resolve over many years. And this started at least less than 10 years after we were married. It was pressure that came from the spouse and the spouse's parents, who insisted that we marry we have a civil marriage and it should be in a community of property.
She says for the most part, her marriage was defined by abuse and neglect, which she tried to resolve through the Islamic tribunals. But after many years of trying to resolve the issues through the processes set out under religious law, she had to ask for an annulment, which she's allowed to do if the husband doesn't agree to do it.
They had suggested that we have counseling for reconciliation, of which I felt wasn't necessary because it was over 20 years of the abuse. And I had passed breakpoint where I decided, after so many years of intervention and mediation, I've used the Jamiyat and the helpline with counseling and the legal clinic as a last resort. Islamically, if he refuses to grant it, and I had applied for the fasakh, which is an annulment, I need to have legitimate reasons for wanting it annulled. And obviously they would call up a mediation or a meeting and have both parties present to discuss the issues and give both parties a fair chance. What he said was that it's not up for discussion. that means nothing to him but just a piece of paper.
She says she is thankful for the intervention of the Help Desk Centre, which offered her counselling and is assisting with finalising her civil marriage divorce. She says, as a devout Muslim woman, she believes in the principles of Sharia law.
My rights as a human being were violated, as well as my Islamic rights as a wife. I honestly felt that as a Muslim woman, I believed in the application of the rules of Sharia first. And as far as the civil marriage went, I had to execute on that as well.
There are many women within our Islamic communities and diverse communities like these, which do have large proportion of Muslim women in them. They choose to apply the Sharia to their marital regimes. You must understand that the application of Sharia is a commandment of God. So for a Muslim, it is a way of life. And for people with strict religious convictions, they want their issues resolved within that dynamic.
I had an episode at home where I was threatened, where I decided to go to domestic violence. And there I was guided by the clerks of the court to go to maintenance. I said, but I'm not aware of that. He said, no, you can apply for maintenance even though you're married. I said, wow, I never knew so many of my rights, which I'm only finding out now after so many years of marriage.
Since the beginning of efforts by activists for Muslim marriages to be recognized in the protection of women and children, especially during divorce or after death, some have argued that at the center of this debate is the patriarchal attitudes that oppress women under the guise of Sharia law. We visited the offices of the Council of the Muslim Theologians in Fordsburg, Johannesburg, to understand what Sharia law is, its application in marriages, and where it places the rights of women.
Muslims believe that we are obliged to follow the law of the Almighty and His beloved Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So Sharia law would be the law that is outlined by the Almighty in His holy book, the Quran, and in the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which is known as a parallel source of Islamic law, which is the Sunnah or the Hadith or the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The Sharia law governs every facet and every aspect of our life. So even down to the minutest details. We believe that family life is society in miniature. So if there is a stable family life, you have a stable community. If we have a breakdown in family life, we have a breakdown in society and community. Islam doesn't look upon women to be in the realm of man for her to be dignified or for her to be honored. In the saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which is narrated in the book of Hadith known as Ibn Asakir, he said, only an honorable man will treat a woman with honor. And it will be a despicable man who will treat a woman in a manner that is not appropriate and unjustly. Because of the importance of family life, we do try to our utmost to reconcile couples. So the Quran says, فَإِمْسَاكُمْ بِمَعْرُوفٍ أَوْ تَسْرِيحٌ بِإِحْسَانٍ, that live together amicably and live together with goodness. And if you can't do so, تَسْرِيحٌ بِإِحْسَانٍ, then separate amicably.
Women can ask for a fasak or annulment, but only men can effect a divorce through a talaq to end the marriage.
Islam does place a certain responsibility upon the man. The husband can give the divorce, but it is also subject to him being accountable in the law and in front of the Almighty with regard to why he has given it. If there is a a situation where there is problems in the marriage, there is an aspect with regard to how he's supposed to deal with it. And part of him dealing with it is to call his wife and to sit down with her, to sit and discuss the matter, and to, as far as possible, try and reconcile it at that particular level without asking for outside intervention. We do have a situation that sometimes husbands do not follow the process.
Some of the challenges is that women do not have recourse to the courts after the talaq or fasaq. They don't have access to the assets that have been joined over the past years that they have been married, and more times than not, those properties are in the name of the husband, which means that they're left with nothing, and that the only recourse is to be able to approach a secular court, because the ulama councils, or those that informal structures that they do go to for divorce, doesn't have the enforcement powers to ensure that the woman gets an equitable distribution of her estate.
In terms of enforcement, we don't have that enforcement because we are not a law enforcement agency. That is why in many instances where there is a situation like, for example, gender-based violence, or where there is children who are being abused, our council would advise situations like that people must take recourse and go to the law so that the law can stop that physical abuse or the gender-based violence. Because we can morally, and we can tell people from a moral perspective and from a religious perspective that you are not supposed to do this. It goes against the commands of the Almighty. But we are not in a position to enforce it.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to Radio Islamic.
While all seem to agree that the state must recognize Muslim marriages, opinion is varied on the content of that recognition. We also visited Radio Islam to understand what the broader public opinion is on the matter. Habib Bobat is a theologian who also presents a talk show on the radio station.
The recognition of Muslim marriages, that is, we all agreeing on that. If you are recognizing the Muslim Marriages Institute, it should be done within the framework of the Islamic law. Any community, for this matter, would be sensitive towards their religious values and their core identity. The listeners are not divided on the issue. It doesn't make sense that you are married to a person for 30, 40 years. When you look at the death certificate of that particular individual, it will show single.
The legal debate about the recognition or regulation of Muslim marriages in South Africa has been going on for many years. In 1987, the South African Law Commission started examining the Muslim personal law. In 1994, the Muslim personal law was recognized in the South African Interim Constitution. This was discontinued due to the lack of a unified voice. In 1996, the Commission renewed interest in the matter and established a project committee looking at Islamic marriages and related matters. In 2001, the Commission published a discussion paper with a proposed draft bill on Islamic marriages and related matters.
So subsequently in 2010, what happened was that the Muslim Marriages Bill was submitted to Cabinet and approved for public comment. The bill was again intended to be introduced to Parliament, and this was way back in 2012. Nothing happened. What also happened over the past 20 years, there was various cases that was done in a what they call a piecemeal manner on a facts-based brought to court to be able to give some form of relief to Muslim women or to Muslim spouses.
Back at the Help Desk Center in Lenasia, women continue to seek assistance in relation to their domestic issues. The center says it deals with women and men married in terms of civil and various religious or customary laws. This woman was married in terms of Muslim religious law only.
I found myself in a situation where I have 3 kids and my youngest being a baby, he's 1 year, 4 months only. And I fought for my divorce. Basically what I did was I went to the Jamiatul Ulama and I sought their help, and our Sharia gives you the right where you can also, you meet the criteria to ask for a divorce, and that is exactly what I did.
She says her husband was addicted to drugs and failed to provide for the family, leading to her suffering a stroke as a result of the stress. Even though her Islamic marriage was annulled, the husband couldn't be forced to maintain his children. The center helped her get a parenting plan.
So it protects me and it protects the children as well, because we now have visitation rights, and if he does want his kids for a holiday, he has to submit drug tests and that sort of a thing. And I've got all of that implemented, and it's now a legal binding document which I now have to take to court and have it made in order of court.
While the debates are ongoing, women on the ground continue to be vulnerable as far as the enforcement of their rights is concerned.
There were many women, more specifically women, in vulnerable positions that did not know the law and were not very well versed with their rights in respect of their rights in terms of the Domestic Violence Act and or the Harassment Act, and what rights can they enforce in respect thereof. So essentially our first point of departure was to conscientize these vulnerable women, support them through other structures such as counseling services and child therapy for their kids, and thereafter we then empower them through the legal systems in approaching the courts for litigation. There's a marked distinction between getting a judgment and enforcing a judgment.
Currently, the state has issued a green paper on marriages, which looks at consolidating all marriages into one bill. The Women's Legal Center believes there is no political will on the part of the state when it comes to Muslim marriages. The state wants an all-encompassing legislation instead of different laws for different groups.
Once the state accepts that there's been an infringement, that there are large numbers of women in these precarious, vulnerable positions whose rights are not being protected, mustn't it follow that there is then an obligation in terms of 7.2 on the state to protect those rights that are not protected?
No, the state does not accept that. I'm at the risk of sounding blunt. The state accepts that legislation would ameliorate the plight of women in relationships where there are already gendered imbalances. And that's why the state says, we have to ask the question, Justice Turan, where does the harm come from in the case of Muslim marriages? The state has every interest in the following: to ensure that the status of people as married couples are recognized, to ensure that there is adequate supervision at the end of that relationship over children and over women who often are left with the economic bad end of the stick in terms of patrimonial consequences. It has now come to the realization and commits to doing the following: rationalizing all of the existing marriage laws. So the 3 separate marriage acts, to rationalize them.
The state has been given enough time over the past 27 years, and it requires much more from the state to be able to show that they respect the rights and can fulfill the rights of Muslim spouses, in particular Muslim women.
Before the Supreme Court of Appeal sent the matter to the Concord for confirmation, it agreed that the state failed to enact or amend legislation in relation to Muslim marriages. and directed it to fulfill such an obligation within 24 months. In the interim, Muslim marriages will be governed by the Divorce and Marriages Act.
Muslim women would be entitled then to a redistribution of assets of their spouse subsequent to divorce. And this was regardless of when the divorce was concluded. Then entitled to the redistribution of assets, which in essence means that all Muslim marriages would be treated as a marriage out of community of property, and except where there were agreements between the couples to the contrary. In the case of a husband who is a spouse in more than one Muslim marriage, then the court would take into consideration all the relevant factors that, or any contract that was concluded at the time, and make any order that the court would deem just and equitable in favor of the second or third spouse.
The judgment also makes the Children's Act apply in Muslim marriages regarding the age of consent, and ordered that sections of the Recognition of Customary Marriages Act be used in cases that require ministerial consent for underage marriages under Sharia law. But some argue that in the law, Muslim couples and children already had relief on various fronts.
From the family court perspective, Muslim women and children were never denied the right to approach these courts. The Maintenance Act makes provision for a Muslim woman or a couple, even a Muslim man, to approach the court for the necessary relief that the Maintenance Act would afford. Likewise, any child that was born out of a Muslim marriage, which as a result of the Children's Act 38 of 2005, protected such children, and they could approach the children's court. Likewise, in terms of the Domestic Violence Act, it didn't preclude any Muslim person from approaching the domestic violence court and getting a protection order or a harassment order. Where the difficulty comes in is that the proprietary consequences, which deals with property issues in a Muslim marriage, that has not been regulated, because there is no laws that recognize the Islamic marriage.
The matter still has a long way to go. If the Concourt orders the state to establish a process for legislation, the lobbying will intensify in Parliament, as they still have to vote on that law, with a significant number of opposing community voices believing that Sharia law can never be compatible with the Constitution.
I'm a member of the Muslim Lawyers Association. And, we have opposed the bill. Our main concern is that, Sharia is based on the Quranic teachings and the practices of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And there are major conflicts between the Sharia and the constitutional principles. And they can, the two can never be married. We can never subject the Quran to the constitutional principles, because there would be great conflict. We don't mind for the recognition, but let the Muslim community then, within their own arbitration circles, within their own tribunals, deal with the consequences of the divorce, or with the consequences of the marriage, or with the consequences of the inheritance laws as such.
We are just saying that there should be a broad legislative framework that will be able to ensure there's recognition as well as registration, as well as broader recourse for women. But the devil is in the detail, and we are not doing the detail. And so for us, there is no doctrinal entanglement. Those issues need to be able to be dealt with by Parliament. It needs to be dealt with by Cabinet, by the state. And parties are free to be able to engage with those processes when it happens.